Episode 10, Andri Feldmann.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Patterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. In today's episode, I speak to Andri Feldmann, and I had a great time talking to Andri. This is the first time we've actually chatted in person, and he's he's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to anything exercise physiology, and I'm sure other things as we get into in the podcast, because he's one of those type of jack of all trades, it seems. But yeah, we had a great discussion around diagnostic tools and thresholds, nears. We spoke on just general sport performance concepts that have been out there for a long time, and some of these models that may or may not be useful, why they may still be useful, and some of the ways that they might not be useful as how they were classically brought up. But this is a really good conversation, and I hope you guys take away from it as much as I did. And I'll leave all the links in the show notes if you guys want to get in contact with Andri or myself. So all that stuff will be in the links, and enjoy. It's funny because whenever I first got into the whole scene with Moxy and the new kind of progressive understanding of bioenergetics, this stuff kind of fractured my mind. It took me some time to really pick up the pieces from all the classical stuff that I'd been brought up under, all the stuff that I held so true to my heart. But whenever I first came across some of your stuff, it was super interesting. Like, I kind of heard a little bit about your father first is who I came across, and then some of your work with climbing. And but from what I understand, you started doing this stuff years ago. Basically, when you were a teenager, you kind of got sucked into it through the athletes that were working with your father and kind of running around. So if you want to just shed a little light about that, because I thought that was super interesting, because you don't see very many teenagers, you know what I mean,
doing lactate, doing blood sampling and lactate.
yeah.
So my dad, Feldmann, he introduced a lot of lactate stuff actually in North America. A lot of the point of care, like the easier to use in-field lactate analyzers in North America. The company that he founded the early 90s. And he then also he trained a bunch of athletes in Switzerland before. So he's part of a bunch of the national teams in Switzerland before he moved. And then in Canada, obviously got involved with some local kids, mountain bikers, actually, which included my sister. I was a little bit too lazy then, so I couldn't get my head around all the high volume training. So I was playing basketball and climbing and doing other stuff. So anyways, that happened pretty young. I followed, or our family followed my dad kind of around the world too, because he'd go to different training camps and give lectures and seminars and stuff. And there was me just in every lecture and in every seminar. I was just sitting there watching my dad. I knew his presentations. It's the same thing every time, right? You kind of know them off, and what he does, and he talks about it. And I would talk to him about it. And soon I would also then, we'd be at these big cycling camps, and we'd be doing lactate tests, and there'd be hundreds of lactate tests. And, my dad's doing this in his grunt work. A lot of it's just grunt work. You have to go and you have to manage the protocol of the test, and you have to take the blood samples and stuff, right? And so basically, as soon as I was able to do it, my dad was like, "Oh, you can go, you can help out now. Then we can get, it's easier," to the point where you can do it and I'll just do the analysis after. You can collect the data, you can do the analysis, but I'll sit down and talk to the athlete about it, right? It just kind of progressed through the whole thing. And that was a ton of fun. I mean, I learned a lot. So I did thousands and thousands of these lactate samplings before I was 18. And that kind of definitely, shoehorned me into this like, what am I going to do? I guess I'm going into kind of sports science, exercise physiology. It was a given. that was going to happen. That's kind of the story of my youth, that I got pushed into that and learned a lot, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah. That's super. Like I don't think that's such a unique experience. I don't think I could probably pinpoint anyone else in the world that's probably done thousands of lactate tests before they're 18. And not only that, when you're doing these tests, you're learning about it. You're going through these, concepts in your head, trying to make sense of it all. What does lactate provide you nowadays? Do you use lactate anymore? Do you think there's any use of it? Do you think when continuous lactate monitors come out, do you think you'll ever play around with that stuff again? Where does lactate sit on the table of tools with you?
Yeah, so I do think lactate's useful. I think there's a shift in the lactate paradigm, is what it means. So maybe this is what you were talking about earlier about these shifts. So a lot of it has to do with this notion of aerobic, anaerobic, what that means. And lactate was so tied into that concept, because lactate accumulation somehow told you something about aerobic, anaerobic. And this goes way back to Fletcher and Hopkins, then Archibald Hill in the 20s, where it's just something like not enough oxygen, hence anaerobic, and that creates lactate production. We all know that that's not true now. You always have lactate production. It always happens regardless of the amount of oxygen that you have available to you. George Brooks is probably one of the most famous proponents of this kind of shift in this lactate paradigm. And lactate really kind of turns out to be just this super important molecule in bioenergetics. So it's Brooks kind of identifies it as this like fulcrum. It acts as this mediator between energy systems. It links up to fat oxidation. It links up to it's obviously the end result of glycolysis. It links up to the regeneration of glycogen in your muscles, the glycogen shunt. So it's just an integral part of the system that is always in play. And if you limit lactate production, if you don't have lactate production, the whole system kind of falls apart. And there's a disease called McArdle's disease. They're missing enzyme in glycolysis. They don't produce lactate. They have huge problems to create any kind of performance.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, when you think, it's funny, when I first initially actually contacted you is because I was looking for a textbook on exercise testing, because I had tried to find, online something that was, somewhat resourceful when it comes to exercise testings for sport. But you threw out George Brooks textbooks, and going through those, it's absolutely thinking that, this guy was on the point so long before anyone else was really, really focused on it, or all the pushback he got on it. And I was talking about this with Skiba the other day, is like, these people that are generally the pioneers and whatever it is, exercise physiology, medicine, orthopedics, a lot of these people get so much pushback, and rightfully so to some degree, but a lot of the times it's just egos that end up stalling the progression and whatever we're talking about, right? Like if everyone would have been on this George Brooks lactate perspective from the 70s, I wonder where we'd be at by now. You know what I mean? I wonder how far ahead. Maybe not. Maybe wouldn't be really much any further ahead. But I think it's interesting, and I think that I'll be interested to see when these continuous lactate monitors come out, to see if there's any other little missing links in there that we never really, picked up on before. But
so maybe quickly on those points there. So purely philosophical. I mean, obviously, if you were able to always make the right choice in development, progress would go faster. That's impossible. I mean, by definition, the right choice would, in most cases, is one choice, but there's hundreds, so it's hard. Usually it's it's righter or wronger. It's kind of like it's always this general direction. So and progress is happening pretty fast. I mean, if we, I'm not, you always say, well, if people would have listened, well, if people would listen, it's always, you might be listening to the wrong guy. It's just the truth of the fact that the data will come out. What does help, though, to that point, is things like these portable lactate analyzers, right? Before, it's like, well, how do you do lactate analysis? You got to do this lab work. And then if someone tells you aerobic, anaerobic has something to do with 2 or 4 millimole lactate as some kind of absolute threshold, you just kind of believe that. Until you get a lactate analyzer, and then you realize you can have 4 or 5 millimole with people doing nothing because they just drank a Coke, and then the sugar gets converted into lactate, and then you measure that, and so it's that. So technology that helps, right? Getting lots of people to collect lots of data helps. I mean, that's with Moxy too. I'll spit something about NIRS and be like, yeah, this happens and this happens, and then it looked like this. And then I get emails, someone's like, yeah, but that's not what happened in my case. And then I'm like, yeah, okay, well, it's more complicated. So it turns out I have a couple buddies at the university, the physicists, and they're always like, yeah, we do physics, it's way easier. And obviously that's not true. They're way smarter than I am, like not even right. But they just say, well, but it's cleaner. And biology is just this messy, confounding factors. It makes publishing, in my opinion, a little bit easier because you can publish contradicting results and just confounding factors, right? Out of different groups, whatever. Physics, I assume that's maybe a little bit harder. Again, I've never published in physics papers. I don't know, but just in conversations with these colleagues of mine that do physics, they're always like, oh, we don't want to do what you do. It's too complicated.
It's so funny in that when you take an intro course, a university course of physics, you're trying to wrap your head around, oh, this is an intro course, is it? But that's actually, to stay on this point here, when we're talking about NIRS, collecting data, now we're seeing some of this stuff with Strava, we're seeing some of this stuff with Garmin, where the sensitivity is obviously not optimal, right? Whether it's, these VO2 max measurements they're doing or the critical power measurements that they're doing, they're not optimal. But the size of the data capture tends to pull out a lot of those factors, right? It tends to overwhelm the inaccuracy of some of these specific single captures. And when you have millions of data points, now everything starts to get a little bit clearer. But coming back to NIRS now, Jem and I kind of had this conversation where we're talking about, the large discrepancy in thresholds, right? When we're talking about pinning down the second breakpoint or whatever, you want to call MLSS, connecting it to that, or critical power. I'm trying to wrap my head around, is this sensitivity? Is this margin of error? Because a lot of people are saying, oh, it's so wide, you can't possibly detect a threshold. But when we're seeing such large discrepancies here, I'm wondering if that is sensitivity akin to HRV versus heart rate, right? We wouldn't go out there and say HRV is useless because the discrepancy is high day to day. Obviously, it's just a very sensitive measure. And when it's sensitive, many things are going to affect that. And I think we've got plenty of things out there, like metabolic carts, VO2 max. It's 3 to 4%. You go from day to day, it's not going to change much. But with NIRS, you're seeing these larger discrepancies. And I'm thinking, hey, maybe this is what we should be focusing in on. What is it? What is that sensitivity coming from? Is that something that's being investigated? Because I think that maybe there's gold there, right? Maybe there's, and I think with training, just using it for training readiness, I've already seen like a lot of good informative connections in my head of being like, oh yeah, that's what that feeling is. That's what that's connected to. Because every time I have that feeling, every time I feel this is what I'm seeing. Maybe it's the sensitivity, maybe it's noise, maybe I don't know. But have you thought about this much? You?
So I mean, there's a lot packed in there. So on like thresholds, so we always want to have this like black and white pictures and these clear, like this is a threshold and it's at 140 watts, right? And you go to 141, you're over 139.
Yeah.
Obviously that's not like that. So daily variations, even ignoring daily variations, that's difficult because humans aren't machines. That's not how we work.
Yeah.
And interesting is at least threshold 2, or what we're going to call the second threshold, has gotten a little bit more publicity on this. Maybe that's what you, Jim, were talking about. It's this idea of this gray zone. You have this kind of transition threshold about what is sustainable and what is not sustainable, which is for most athletics the relevant point. What can I sustain, right? It's not, I mean, threshold 1 is interesting in things like what kind of substrates am I using, right? Am I using fat? But threshold 2 is much more the performance orientated one. What can I sustain for the duration of my event, and how do I balance that out? How long am I going over or not? And this is what critical power would do, right? I like critical power a lot because at its core you eliminate the physiology. It's just what power can I sustain? And if I can sustain this power, then that's my critical power. And if I can't sustain it, now there's a lot of back and forth about like the actual mathematical modeling and does it really reach an asymptote and what does that asymptote even mean? And obviously, if you do it for 24 hours, that's not going to keep stabilizing. At some point, you're dead. So obviously, it goes to 0. So maybe it's more like logarithmic or something. From a practical perspective, I'm not too worried about that. So you just need to figure out what is the duration you have to sustain exercise for and find out where that asymptote is for that duration. And for most, let's say, semi-endurance type things, you're looking at 20 minutes to 2 hours. And usually that fits into a critical power asymptote, which has a little bit to do with training status and stuff too. But so I like critical power for that reason, because you get rid of the other stuff. It's pure just output, which is the goal of an athlete. Now, the physiological thresholds are important to inform us about the performance. And so this gray zone, all of a sudden you have critical powers, like is usually considered the top area. It's like the very top of what sustainable exercise is, or at least that's what it comes out in the studies. And then you have like the more classical steady state, the maximal steady state parameters like MLSS, right? So maximal lactate steady state, that usually ends up significantly lower in critical power. So you kind of get this zone. And when we talk about, well, it's so hard to even get that threshold because it's obviously some kind of wide gray zone between something like MLSS and critical power. Something that I've been discussing now with some colleagues is, but is that such a wide zone for everyone? Because there's some data that says that some athletes have like this huge wide zone there. Like it's just basically MLSS is way down here and critical power is way up here. It's like this huge. And some have a much smaller one where it's actually coupled real friggin' tight. Those are things that we're kind of discussing right now, which I think is really interesting. And I think training status and to a certain extent training status and to the other side, like the type of training you do influences like how big that kind of area is that you have. I mean, it's kind of the same as like, what is your VO2 max and what's the VO2 that you can actually, or that you're sustaining at. So these gaps, they change between people. And I think those gaps are just as relevant, the size of these, as where this actual pinpoint is and how accurate can we get it. Does that, I think there was a bunch more questions you had, but I already forgot them all.
No, this is good to say, because that was kind of my guess, is to, the higher the training status, the higher the training age, all these things, the more tightly coupled these thresholds are going to be. And I think it makes sense when you look at fractional utilization and VO2 max and these things. When you see the most elite athletes, how tightly coupled these things are and how stable they are, it's amazing, right? Like, so that was kind of my guess. Like the less trained you are, the more inefficient the machine is, and it's leaking from all these different points. And it's like, how, like, it's a mess. There's oil everywhere, right? It's trying to to wonder why there's so much variability. But yeah, that was, it's funny because I was just about to ask you that. Was what do you think the training status has to do with it? But what what do you like when we're talking about, you know, these NIRS breakpoints? And I've done this now quite a few times with lactate, and I found extremely tight correlations between the breakpoints on lactate, or the turn points on lactate, and the breakpoints with NIRS. Now it's funny because everyone else's is kind of the same, like they're very tightly coupled, but they're relatively different for each person. Like they have the different profiles. Like this person, it's, you know, 45 seconds after, this person, it's whatever, you know, 50 seconds before. Generally, you're going to find it there. You're going to find the signal. And also the breakpoints look different, right? Like we have the, like the terms Jem was using, like monotonic and non-monotonic. You see that kind of profile with the NIRS. But I found super tight correlations between breakpoints and turn points with lactate. Have you found that to be the case? Have you seen that to be the case in the stuff that you've done with NIRS?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a dozen publications on basically lactate trends and NIRS trends.
Yeah.
And they all show relationships, but they don't all always show the exact same relationship.
Yeah.
Now, some of that has to do with how you analyze your lactate data, because you can pick different models for analyzing your lactate data.
Yeah.
Some of that has to do with the NIRS parameters you pick and how you want to analyze those. So are you using like a percent like SMO2, or are you using just your deoxy? Are you using there's ones that use just oxy or HB difference, so oxy minus deoxy. So there's some inconsistencies there. If we talk specifically about the Moxy now and muscle oxygenation as a percent, generally speaking, I think 2 thresholds are detectable, and they generally line up with lactate, which with what would be classically a lactate threshold 1 and 2, or what would classically be a ventilatory threshold 1 and 2. And generally, I find that the second thresholds line up closer, and the first threshold, you get the break point in muscle oxygenation having a little bit earlier than what the lactate response is, for example, generally speaking. Now, I think that so yeah, and then you get these different profiles. That's a whole different thing. So you just get breakpoints. Now, generally speaking, the breakpoints manifest themselves in you have something like an SMO2 plateau at the beginning. Sometimes that even increases. And then you have a linear decline in muscle oxygenation to a second breakpoint where it kind of plateaus out. And we're talking about incremental exercise. So this is a ramp test or a step test, but the step test with generally shorter steps. So the longer you go, you get generally the same response, but the protocol matters. It affects the response of your signal. That's the general, that's what Jem was calling the monotonic. He calls it monotonic because it's just this linear decrease, right? And then this curvilinear response you get to, and which is more the way that I see the curvilinear response is you have a plateau or an increase at the beginning, followed by something like a breakpoint, and then followed by a second breakpoint. But the second breakpoint isn't like a positive deflection. It doesn't attenuate the response. It drops further down. So it kind of does this, whereas the other one kind of does the opposite response. And those are in SMO2, the general 2 patterns that I get. You can fit basically everyone into one of those 2 profiles. And I think those profiles themselves say something about the athlete. Generally, you have lower absolute SMO2 values in the monotonic profile than in this curvilinear one. Usually drop down as far. Yeah, so I don't know if that helps.
No, that does help. Why? I know you don't have maybe a clear answer for this, but in your best guess, why do you think we see, and I know Jem and Sean were talking about this the other day, they put some stuff out on YouTube. I mean, everyone's talked about it, I think. But what is your guess on why we're seeing those two different profiles? Adipose thickness, myoglobin, mitochondrial respiration. What is it that you think is behind these two dramatic profiles? What do you see else in their have you seen anything else in their metabolic data? Have you seen anything else in their lactate data that would suggest, oh, maybe this is what we're seeing? Fiber typology, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, all those could be factors. I know Jem was big on the adipose tissue one, based on his data too.
Mm-hmm.
I think adipose tissue matters and can definitely affect the profile. I don't think that is by any means the factor that's creating that. And so I have data with the same athletes, and you go from running to cycling, same measurement spot, you get reversed in profiles if you go from running to cycling. And they have the same adipose tissue thickness. So it's not just the adipose tissue thickness. At least it's like recruitment of muscles in different moving patterns that now changed what's happening. So while adipose tissue thickness is always something to consider when you're doing any NIRS, you got to be careful about that. The changing of these profiles, I don't think are solely based on adipose tissue thickness. I generally think that they may have more to do with the ability to transport and use oxygen. So basically, in my because we're measuring one muscle site, if you're doing cycling and you do the VL, in trained cyclists, you will always get this linear response. If you take those trained cyclists and you put them running, that's not guaranteed. You can get the curvilinear response. So the statement that I'm going to make is like based on the muscle almost more than the athlete, in that if you have a high VO2, if you are very fit and trained, you are more likely to get this monotonic response. And I mean, Jem does see, and I see this too, is that you get this monotonic response very clearly in the VL and like less so in the rectus femoris if you do cycling. And that again might have to do with the recruitment pattern, because the way that the VL is recruited very linearly with increasing exercise, where the RF isn't, it increases recruitment towards higher performance. So it might be that's also causing some of this shift in the pattern. But if we go from cycling, just high VO2 correlates with this monotonic pattern. So I think it has something to do with the muscle you're measuring's ability to extract and use oxygen in relation to the supply. And if that muscle is able to do that very well, it's going to progressively, continuously use oxygen to some kind of extraction plateau where you've kind of minimized it down to the bottom.
That's interesting, because when you said that, I completely forgot that I've done this with cycling and running, and it's exactly what you just said. I've linear response in cycling. With running, it's more curvilinear. And also on that point, I'm thinking now the position that the rectus femoris is in, whenever you're in cycling, there's much more tension in that position when your knee is in flexion and you're in higher hip flexion, and also the vascular response. All those things are going to change as well, right? More peripheral vascular resistance. It makes sense that you're going to see a more linear response with cycling compared to when you're upright with running, the position of the rectus femoris, and also the loading on it. It's you're 200, 200 milliseconds, maybe 250 milliseconds of ground contact. Obviously, you're getting some rectus femoris when you're pulling through and stuff, but it does make sense. Like two different demands, right? Two different demands would probably make for two different responses, especially.
Yeah, I mean, the VL is just really prominent in this knee extension, right?
Yeah.
And rectus femoris goes over the hip, so it's going to be a lot more of the hip extension as well, which in running, I mean, this is why the Nike guys, when we talk to them, they use rectus femoris for running. It probably makes more sense.
Yeah.
It is, maybe a little tangent on this, it is one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to use muscles that aren't directly involved, because you kind of, potentially take away some of the noise of like which muscle you're picking and how is it activating. So a lot of the lower arm measurements for cycling and running, where it's not as directly involved, assuming you're not like death gripping your handlebars, is pretty interesting. And a lot of the second threshold stuff line up pretty good with break points. So you don't really get a good first break point in a lot of the secondary muscles, like you in the primary. But the second break point you find, all of a sudden you get a deflection point, which is pretty interesting. There's actually some papers on this from quite like 2004, like pretty far back. If you like dig through the literature, some people that are already were showing it like way back. That this is interesting. And I'd like to give them some more love, but I don't remember the authors. But I could look it up. It's somewhere in my data bank. But yeah, so that lines up pretty good. And there's that, the Brett Kirkman paper where they did the forum with the running. So I do think that's a pretty interesting route to go again, but it doesn't work it's totally training status dependent. It doesn't work with untrained, like they get no results.
Yeah.
So,
and something I wanted to discuss here is, now this is something I was playing around with powerlifters. I reached out to you because trying to collect some data, do some data collections on several different things. Dude, I never realized how hard it was to recruit participants for certain things. Hey, I'll give you free testing. Just come in here and let me collect some data. It's like, I understand why it's mostly university students in that program doing these studies, because people just, anyways. But one thing I've noticed is I'm seeing very loose, I mean, anywhere from, our values of 0.35 to 0.65 with barbell velocity and SMO desaturation. And I'm trying to find the right signal points. Like right now, the cleanest signal I get is the tibialis anterior. I mean, I think the low adipose tissue, there's a lot of things, but it gets like the protocol to get the person into the squat and all this is so complicated, because anytime they load the foot, you're going to get kind of noise. But once they're in the position for the squat and you time everything, it's super clean data. It's super clean. But I'm trying to wrap my head if this is just, noise, because I heard you say, like, the specific demand is not going to affect that when we were talking about sprinting, right? When we're talking about the whole cycling and desaturation and stuff like that. Do you think there could be something there? Like, do you think that makes sense, that the higher the barbell velocity and also the higher the loads, because we're doing 3 reps, right? So we're getting a little bit of time under tension there of squatting. Do you think there could be something there? Do you think that makes sense to you? Or do you think it might just be noise?
So I do think that the rate of change of muscle oxygenation has something to do with energy flux, which how quickly, which should have something to do with power. Now, the issue with the Moxy for sure is a little bit resolution that you have. I mean, at 2 hertz, it's such a slow resolution, right? It's a problem, and you're still a little bit off of where. I mean, it depends how many reps you're doing. But I mean, if you're looking for like max power, like 1 rep, it might be that the delay slope that you're getting after is a direct reflection of the energy flux that's taking place. But I'm not sure if that's true or not. So, but if you do a couple more, if it's about like something like repeated power, let's say, if that makes sense. I do think that, at least in the data that I have, or like this paper that we're going to publish with the German track cycling team, who are all power, that there's a good correlation between slope, basically desaturation, and power. So a higher desaturation rate, more power.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so and I interpret that as directly your muscle oxidation slope is directly linked to energy flux,
Mm-hmm.
um, right through the creatine phosphate shuttle, and therefore, yeah, I do think you can monitor that. And generally speaking, in hockey players that we did, that went pretty good too. Higher sprint speeds at higher desaturation rates.
Okay. So this was the
So
paper that you did with the shuttle sprints. Was that what it was, or this something different?
the poster
Yeah,
board.
yeah,
So yeah, we didn't publish that,
yeah.
but we just did with a professional hockey team here in Zurich. We did shuttle sprints, and yeah, I think that was on there. But generally speaking, I mean, there's so much hockey data, so I don't exactly remember what was on. I know what was on there for sure, which is interesting, is that the delay in oxygen recovery in the break, that is highly correlated with sprint speed. So the longer the delay takes, which is interesting. And there's also a paper on this. It's basically this delay. So post-exercise delayed response in oxygen recovery seems to be linked with high oxidative fibers. So basically, the better you can use oxygen, the longer that delay will take, because you're still using oxygen.
A larger energy crisis.
Yeah. So you have you have a large energy crisis because you just blew through a bunch of energy.
Yeah.
But you likely have a quicker energy crisis response because you're using so much oxygen in rest to try to to get this energy crisis dealt with.
Yeah.
But you just have to give often the I don't know if you get this, but I see this often, that usually the high power athletes are also the ones that need the most recovery. That's not always the case. And you get these optimized guys that just high power and recover fast. But generally it's like you have high power, bad recovery, or good recovery, but you'd like to get them some more power. And you're somehow there's some contradiction. And I know there's some papers on that. It's basically fiber size and oxidative capacity paradox. Like you can't have these huge power muscles and have this good oxidative capacity, which would be the recovery / endurance parameter. And these are somehow at odds with each other. And you have to somehow balance these things out.
Yeah, the organism.
I don't know how. Yeah, go for it.
The organism would end up killing itself, right? There has to be some type of break point for protective mechanism to save itself, right? Like there has to be some line in the sand where it's like, you're going too far, you're getting too close to death, right? Yeah, that's definitely what I see. And I generally see like these guys that, and it's the same with recovery, because I see it the same with recovery too. Autoregulation. So this is a good point to start talking about now. Is what I've always seen is like in training, you have, you have, let's just say your for simplicity, fast twitch guys versus slow twitch guys. When you use autoregulation, the slow twitch guys tend to overtrain, right? Because that drop off happens far too late in the series, because they just keep hammering at 100%, and that drop off never comes. Obviously, it depends what you're using for autoregulation, but let's just say speed or time, because it's simple, right, for sprinting. Whereas these fast twitch guys, that autoregulation mechanisms work really, really well, because that drop off happens so quickly. The body's responding like, hey, you blew through it. You gotta, you gotta recover. Whereas with the, other side of the coin is where you don't use autoregulation. The slow twitch guy ends up never really overtraining, because the load is just generally suited more towards them, where the fast twitch guy ends up overtrained fairly quickly, because they're not even close to the same amount of sets that they should be doing. The fast twitch guy maybe needs 2 or 3. But then I started thinking about the fiber itself. It's like, with that new research that Van der Swerk came out with, you'd saying like, the type 2 fibers, type 2A, can have a high oxidative capacity, right? Like similar to what we're seeing in type 1, but the recovery doesn't seem to be the same. Like for some reason, like the damage because maybe of the speed of contraction of that muscle is different, and the response, like the inflammatory response, all these other things, maybe that's why we're not seeing recovery. But have you seen that to be the case in what I'm talking about, like day-to-day recovery? Is these fast twitch guys after a sprint session, they're out and probably 2-3 days before they're getting back to baseline, versus these slow twitch guys, they wake up, like ready to go, basically. Not a big response. Like they're not seeing, poor SMO2 responses. You're not seeing poor HRV responses. Is that the case you've seen?
So, I'm not sure. So, at least in pro, but even in semi-pro, from my experience, if you start working with endurance athletes, or let's say power athletes,
Mm-hmm.
You're already biasing your population already at the semi-pro level, and that if you're working with sprinters or any kind of power athletes, you're already getting the only athletes that are there are more like fast twitch athletes.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really, and if you go to endurance, you're going to have more of those. And what is for sure is that the volume of training that you can do in the power segment is just way lower.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, I mean, you can't do nearly as much. And generally, the best coaches that I know are the ones that I've worked with who've had the most success. They do it for power athletes, do an underwhelming amount of volume. Like you're like, what?
Yeah.
You're gonna let them do nothing again? Like, what? They're just gonna come into prehab again? It's like, yep, don't need any more. And then they do a couple, a bunch of them use Moxy really well. They'll like come in and do like one set and be like, holy moly, no desaturation rate, SM2's not coming down, velocity, bar speed, jump height, whatever, real bad, just training scrap, come back tomorrow. And that almost never happens with endurance athletes. Yeah. So you're there every day and you just pound. Now, I don't know if you have to do that with endurance athletes, but you certainly need a lot more volume at the event already. What I'm not quite sure to maybe get to your question more is, I don't know if you would take one of those endurance athletes and put them into the power sport, if basically what you are illustrating, if that would then come to pass. Do you kind of see what I mean by if you're taking power sports, you've already biased. Like, I mean, the variation isn't. Yeah. The athletes there are going to be the type of athletes where you're already there. You'd have to create an experiment where you're basically, or either you go really young before like those divergences have been made and realizations have been made where it's like, I'm actually really fast, or I'm not really fast. So I don't know. So I'm kind of avoiding your question that I don't really know.
I understand, because I wasn't clear. Like, I'm thinking, because lately I've been thinking a lot about 800-meter runners, right? Because I talked to Paul Larson. I wanted to talk to Gareth, but he's super busy lately. But with the ASR, APR model, like the anaerobic speed reserve, I'm trying to get to that through, obviously you can get to that through critical power W prime. I think that's a fairly good model. It holds up kind of similarly in terms of understanding the profile of the athlete, but also with NIRS data and seeing like, hey, what can we pull out here? Are these similar? Because I'm seeing that with, for example, with running, when you see that linear response versus the curvilinear response, those pretty much always line up well with, fast twitch, slow twitch, high anaerobic speed reserve, low anaerobic speed reserve. And I'm wondering, is that to do with the muscle?
Do you get a lot of curvilinear response in 800-meter runners? Like in like the fast runners that I do, I get a linear response, like almost always.
No, I'm not saying for 800-meter runners. I'm talking about runners in general. I'm just talking about runners in general. So I'm wondering if 800-meter runners, if there's something to be found there, if you're going to see a difference in those responses correlating to the anaerobic speed reserve. Because I've been pulling my hair out trying to figure out, like, what are we trying to get out of some of this stuff? Because when we're talking about VLA max on the forum, I was like, what are we actually trying to solve for with VLA max? What is it that we're trying to get at with this? What is the point of it? What are we trying to connect it to? And I'm going to have a talk with Bjorn Kafka that that works for AeroTune and get his take on it, because I like in the brief conversation that we had, he's just like, yeah, VLA max is useless. But he's saying the same thing I was thinking, is like, the concept is not useless, and trying to find something that fits that concept well. What do you find? What do you use with an athlete? I mean, every athlete's going to be different, right? Every athlete's going to have different responses depending on the sport and demands. But what are your go-tos for profiling? What makes the most sense for you to profile? Is it NIRS? Is it the metabolic cart? What is the simplest? Like what is your go-to thing when you got athletes coming in the door? I want to profile these athletes. What are your steps to do that? Because obviously VLA max is kind of one of those things that we're trying to profile the athlete, right?
Yeah, so I don't do that very many lactate measurements anymore. And I understand. I went pretty hard from, again, doing all these lactate measurements to basically like lactate's useless, I'm not doing it anymore. Back to no, you just got to use it in the right context. Which I think is probably the right. So maybe quickly on that point. So for example, if it's about like real endurance, so like fat substrate utilization, I think lactate can be a pretty useful measure to use. I mean, obviously metabolic carts are as well, right? You can get RQ or RER or whatever. But if you start measuring higher amounts of lactate in the blood, the chances are you're not doing fat oxidation anymore. So lactate production, when glycolysis gets a higher rate and you start having a lot of lactate production, lactate inhibits fat oxidation. So it inhibits not only beta oxidation directly, but it also limits fatty acid mobilization and transportation. So if you're like, hey, you have an Ironman out, and you're like, hey, we got to limit your, protect your glycogen stores. We got to maximize fat, and you're going to do some trainings. You can periodically do some lactate measures. It's super easy. Make sure lactate's low. Now that doesn't mean lower than 2 milliliters. It depends on your athlete, but just make sure you don't have low levels. So the issue with lactate is it's such an indirect measure, and it's always like, the assumption is the lactate measures that you're getting this information directly from the muscle, but you're really just getting this wishy-washy measure that's the end result of lactate produced and lactate consumed again in the muscle, or in an adjacent muscle, or in an adjacent muscle, and then you measure and you're here at some point in time. That's the problem. So if people are like, lactate's useless, I understand where they're coming from. I was there. From a practical perspective, I still think that it's useful. And if you talk to someone like George Brooks, he thinks it's useful as well. You just get a proper context. To what I use directly to the question, I think metabolic carts are very useful. So these pulmonary gas exchange measures, a lot of onset kinetics are very useful. It helps you with things like efficiency. VO2 max usually isn't that important. It doesn't really matter. Like, you can look at it and you're cool and have a high number, and obviously the higher number, that correlates with performance. But the event usually isn't who has the highest VO2 max; it's who wins the race. So it's not a guarantee. So it's more like you need to have a good VO2 max to be a good endurance athlete, but it doesn't matter. At some point, you're at 70, and it probably doesn't matter anymore anyways. But what seems to be more important is things like, when you're running at race pace, what is your VO2, and can you become more efficient? Like, are you, for your pace, lowering your oxygen consumption? That's a positive, because you're becoming more efficient. And for example, if you listen to Andy Jones, they talk about Danielle Radcliffe, and she in London, she won, and she set a new record for marathon, and she had a lower at that world record time. Her VO2 max wasn't as high as it was earlier in her career, but she was became super efficient, right? So I think the profiling of metabolic carts, I think NIRS is very useful. Obviously, I'm highly biased. One of the reasons why I think NIRS is so useful is because you can use it day to day, where a metabolic cart, even if you take something like the really cool portable devices that are available today, like VO2 Master, which are great tools. You're not wearing that every day. I mean, there's some athletes that'll do it because they're insane,
Yeah.
but
It
oh
sucks.
man, it's no good, right? You
Yeah.
can use it more often than a lab card, which is
Yeah.
nice. So you can check on it more often, but the portable NIRS devices really are like it's basically a heart rate monitor. Like you can go ahead and use it every time. So I definitely like that. Maybe one comment a little bit to the profiles. And what I do find intriguing is, I see this with data that I've collected at the university, but what's nice is there's a publication on this as well, which kind of backs everything up. And that is that you do kind of get these two profiles, this monotonic and this curvilinear. And if you manipulate those people with hypoxia or hyperoxia, so you basically take oxygen or you give them oxygen, that has an effect, and the effect is different based on the profiles.
Oh, wow.
So basically, if you put an athlete that has this monotonic profile, they're generally the athletes that have the higher performance output, which we already talked about. They generally also have the higher VO2 max. They have a greater decrement that in performance if they go to hypoxic environments than the athletes who have more of this curvilinear response. Which kind of fits into this very simplistic idea of supply and utilization limited, which is obviously a lot more complex than that. But you just say, well, these one guys, look, they're just decreasing SMO2 and it plateaus out. They're using all their oxygen, simplistically said. If you just give them more, they would do better. But if you take it away, then they're going to do way worse. Whereas these other guys who have more of this curvilinear, they never actually hit something like an extraction plateau. If you take it away, it doesn't matter as much because they had never used it all anyways. So these things, and there is research to support a lot of these things. I mean, there's some studies out there by the one I'm thinking of is, I think it's Richardson, but it's a huge list of authors. I would take a look, but it shows nicely that if you take trained and untrained and you get them to do knee extensors and cycling, so kind of isolated, and you do biopsies and you check mitochondrial function capacity, and then you check their knee extensor VO2 and their whole body VO2, that you basically have this like linear, in untrained, you have a very nice linear response in that basically the mitochondrial capacity and VO2, they link up linearly. But you don't have that happen in the trained. And that's because, and the argument there is, well, in the trained, you have basically endless mitochondrial capacity to use oxygen, but it's just, you just get this peak out point because the oxygen is just not there to be used. That's the argument from the group. And this goes again to this utilization supply argument. And so there's a lot of discussion around that. If NIRS is useful, that's a different thing. I think it's useful.
I think it is useful too. And I think like it's just in the beginning. To me, I'm like, the fact that it's already this useful at this stage of time with the amount of research that we have at our hands on NIRS, I think that's already a win. Like if this was the peak of, data and peak of understanding surrounding NIRS, I'm like, oh, this is a win. This is a huge win. You're telling me for $1,000, something that an athlete can just stick on their leg, they can take it off and go do whatever. And you know what I mean? You don't even have to be there. It's already hugely useful, right? Whether it's for the breakpoints, whether it's for the profiles, whether it's for day-to-day training. I think it's already a win. Something interesting on that point that brought up something is, I know you've had some experience with the physio flow. This is something, unfortunately, I've spent way too much money these last few years, and I can't just dig a deeper hole right now. But this is something I do want to get my hands on. I've settled with the EKG for now. I'm super interested in cardiac morphology and understanding, okay, different, athletes, the different changes you're seeing, also the different genetics, like where these athletes are from, whether they're African American, Caribbean, these types of things, trying to understand all these different changes you see in the cardiac morphology. But one thing I am super interested in with the PhysioFlow is stroke volume and exercise. And I had this conversation with Coley Moore where I'd found some newer research on stroke volume and specifically how to train the stroke volume. Now, it wasn't, the research didn't suss out anything to do with, is this what we're actually after? Is this what we're trying to change? Because what they did was they had athletes basically run at 70% of VO2 max or whatever it was. And this was considered kind of peak stroke volume. And what they did was they split 20 minutes into 2 blocks, or just like ran 20 minutes straight. And the time at peak stroke volume was higher for the athletes that split those 20 minutes up into 2 10-session blocks versus the athletes that just did it straight. So their kind of understanding and perspective takeaway was from that, well, this is going to give you higher signaling for stroke volume. I threw this out to Cole, and he's like, I'm not sure on, how they're measuring the stroke. Like, he wasn't familiar with the device, and neither was I. I've never heard of that device for measuring stroke volume. I can't even remember what it is. But, and then the other thing was, he sent me some research and also kind of glossed over this with me in the conversation, was that, peak stroke volume continues to rise up until maximal cardiac output. And after him showing me this and sending some research along too, I ended up finding some research on this as well. Is this what you've seen with the PhysioFlow? Do you see this plateau with stroke volume? Because the only markers I have to test that is VO2 pulse, and obviously that's not a very accurate, measure of stroke volume. But what have you seen with the PhysioFlow and stroke volume through incremental exercise?
Yeah, so stroke volume is pretty interesting because classically it is something where it's like, you get to 60% of VO2 max and stroke volume plateaus out. That's a classic picture.
Yeah.
And so a lot of kind of stroke volume training is around like 60%. That's where you got to go.
Yeah.
Now that there's lots of studies out there that show that's not the case. And with using the PhysioFlow, that's definitely not the case, at least the data that I've seen. You get very different profiles. You do get a lot that get that something like 50, 60, 70% plateaus out. That happens often.
Yeah.
You get a lot that have just a perfect linear response all the way up. Almost everyone has an increase in stroke volume at the beginning. It doesn't happen that you don't. But definitely those responses are a lot more individual. Some have a decrease in stroke volume towards the end. That happens actually more often than you think. So probably heart rate gets too high, and then you have a problem with filling.
Yeah.
Which it does show like it would be inefficient. So you think it wouldn't. It happens more often than you think, which in itself is interesting. It may make sense. So I mean, for stroke volume training, this idea, at least it makes sense to me, is to figure out, well, how do I get the highest stroke volume, and then I'm going to train there. Yeah. You should then probably not use a generic 70%. I mean, if you're able to, you might as well just measure everyone's stroke volume and find out where they're the highest, which is a problem is if you have a linear response to maximum. Maximum. But to that point, I mean, there's this study from a group here in Zurich where they got the highest stroke volume response in sprint intervals and not in constant load. And they augmented and got a way higher stroke volume response is if you do intermittent like occlusions. Like you occlude the leg completely. You venously occlude the legs, you cycle, you open it, you get this huge like backflow of blood. And then it's like makes this huge preload and you get this huge stroke volume. And they're like, well, maybe that's the signal. Maybe you do some kind of intermittent high contraction work, to kind of push that stroke volume button a little bit.
Concentric hypertrophy. And that makes sense when you're seeing like the cardiac morphology of, lifters, CrossFitters, these types of guys that have these,
I mean, they get a lot of times to the right morphology. It's bigger, right? Because they're doing these valsalva.
Yeah, the right. Yeah.
Pushing a lot of pressure, right? Which isn't necessarily what you're looking for as an endurance athlete. But
Yeah, exactly. I mean, cyclists too, they have more of that than a runner would as well, from what I've
Yeah.
seen.
Yeah, because they get more like, it's more that pressure
Yeah,
and running's funny because running's, I think, is a lot more just efficiency. I mean, if you look at runners, they don't have these big muscles that they're moving or that they have to
yeah,
supply. It's just like, can I pendle my leg? I need long legs that I can pendle
yeah,
back and forth, and good elastic properties that every time I hit the ground, it just comes back up without me having to do anything.
yeah,
Whereas cycling, it's like you got to push like the piston down every time,
yeah.
right?
Much more time spent with contraction in the muscle compared to running. You have this short impulse and, you know, this flow through. And that, yeah, that's funny because a lot of people don't think about the right ventricle much, but and especially the atria as well. But when you're thinking about it, all that blood that's going into the right ventricle, all that has to get pushed through the pulmonary, right? All that, the blood that's going to the rest of your body, which you're going to, you know, feed with oxygen, that all has to go up into the lungs. And the amount of pressure that is involved with that, sending all that blood through and forcing all that blood through, you're going to see a lot quicker you know, adaptations in the right ventricle than you are going to see in the left ventricle generally, right? You always see that. But yeah, that's interesting. So what do you guys currently like? And I don't know if you're still using it, but I know you said you borrowed it from your father. What I heard from the conversation you had with Sean, what were you specifically using the PhysioFlow? What were you trying to tease out in experimenting around with that? Were you just kind of looking around, taking a peek, and seeing if you could, yeah, glean anything, or was there anything specific?
Yeah, no, with the stuff with the PhysioFlow was usually more exploratory.
Yeah,
So I don't have any publication where I go into specific, like I'm setting up an experiment and I want to go check this out.
yeah,
Um, what I'm more what I would like to do, this is kind of this big project plan that I have. We'll see if I get it done or not, and depending on what happens in the next 6 months
mm,
with other projects, is I want to really try to get like whole body profiling of these systems with 20 Moxys and PhysioFlow and metabolic cart, and then go and get single athletes in, like, get amateur cyclist, a pro cyclist, a pro runner, and kind of get one of each and
mm-hmm,
profile each of them and see how those compare. So I've done that a little bit with like runners and cyclists, and switching up disciplines to see how responses are different. That's what I actually want to do with the PhysioFlow. That's one of my more, but I mean, you kind of mentioned a little bit. I mean, I've thought about PhysioFlow and looking at THB responses and see if I can tickle something out there. Because we talked about muscle oxygenation responses, and you kind of get two profiles. In the THB response, a total hemoglobin response, you get a lot of different ones, and they're not always as straightforward as you'd like them to be.
yeah,
And maybe you get something with what is stroke volume or cardiac output profiles and what is hemoglobin profiles. Maybe that's something I've thought about, but I haven't done that. So
that's interesting. Oh, if there was only more money and more time, I don't know how people don't. Anyways, I don't know how people sleep at night. I don't sleep at night. Think about all this stuff. Anyways, the I did want to kind of touch back on that investigation you're doing with the cycling team, because I'd like to hear, you know, your thoughts on why do you think, when we're talking about a homogeneous group, why are we seeing, and Motter found this as well, or maybe it was Ulbrich. I think it was Ulbrich that found this as well, and rowers, where he found, when we're talking about a homogeneous group, the higher the power output for whatever it is, measurement for sprint intervals, the lower the VLA max. Right? What is your guess to why that is? Why do you think that's there? Do you think it's creatine phosphate, or is
yeah, and it's interesting because you would think that the higher the VLA max, so which is like the quicker the turnover of glycolysis, the quicker you produce lactate, the higher the energy flux.
Yeah.
But that's not what's coming out, right? It's like the opposite, because often VLA-max is equals glycolytic power.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, this seems to be a little bit in contradiction, at least the way that I read it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't talk to that many VLA-max guys. I'm definitely a lot more North America orientated than Germany, which Europe, continental Europe's pretty big on VLA-max, and North America's having a little less on it. Now, I think it makes sense if you think about it, in that the better. So basically, if you have a high glycolytic flux, you're producing lots of you're producing a lot of lactate.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to maintain power, to keep going, you actually want to take that lactate and you want to keep using it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're using it in neighboring muscle fibers or downstream a little bit. And if you're using it again, well, then it doesn't pop up.
Yeah.
Then it doesn't pop up in your measurement. And so basically, if you have someone who's producing lots of it, which I think all of them are, I think all of them, if you looked in the muscle, is producing lactate like mad.
Yeah.
But I don't think that they all recycle and reuse efficiently the same amount.
Yeah.
And the ones that can do that better, we're going to have more power, more sustained power.
Yeah.
And the VLA-max will be lower.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think is happening from a mechanistic point of view.
Yeah.
So that it makes sense to me, and it makes sense why their desaturation rate's faster, because in order to burn through all of this lactate, they have to keep using oxygen at a very high rate.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, and I hate discussing, especially in forums, you're like rush, you're trying to get stuff out there, and or even in podcasts sometimes, like I've made statements before where I'm like, I'm talking about certain things and it sounds like, oh yeah, I'm all for VLA-max. It's not that. I'm all for the investigations of these things. Like I was talking about BFR the other day, and I was like, I think this holds huge, potential. And I was going on about like, oh, it's all about getting the most out of your time. So, but really what I'm getting at is I don't really care about BFR. I don't think it's going to have much applicability for most people outside of the rehab setting. Maybe it does, but we're already seeing that uncoupling from like, okay, you're getting the adaptations, but it's not, changing the performance. What I'm more interested is understanding what are the mechanisms behind this. The same with VLA-max. I don't really care about VLA-max. I'm interested in the investigations, because with these investigations, the more we're going to uncover about mechanism, and the more we're going to uncover about mechanism, the more we're going to be able to pull the levers and try and see, future investigations, right? What do we pull for future? So yeah, if people are wondering why we keep talking about VLA-max or why I'm asking about it, it's that reason. I think, there's something there to be gleaned, especially I think when we see these continuous lactate monitors, I think we'll probably glean a little bit more. It's not going to be the cure, but I just think you're just going to see more, just like when insulin comes out, like the continuous insulin monitors, we'll just get another piece. But so yeah,
so I like, sorry, I mean, just a little bit on VLA-maxes. I do like the basically where lactate kind of developed as a metric and where we're at now. I think I understand VLA-max, and I understand why people are interested in it. And I think the thoughts behind why this could be a useful metric makes a lot of sense to me. Totally understandable. It's not about value, it's about rate of change. I think that makes sense. The problem is always there is like you're measuring at a fingertip or an earlobe, and you really don't know what's happening. That's kind of the limitation of all these lactate measurements. But it's funny anyways about how people like VLA-max, it's dumb, it's useless. But I mean, I can name, I can get you a bunch of athletes that are pretty damn good, and they train based on kind of VLA-max information that you're getting. This is always the problem, is that you've got all these different thresholds and all these different things, and you can always find athletes that are world-class that use this, right? And so obviously, it's like, what's the proper way to train, and what are the proper thresholds? What's the proper? It's like, first of all, probably just organize your training around something and track progress. Like fuck it doesn't matter what you use, just organize it, track, and see what's happening. And when you're making progress, make sure you're making progress, what you did. When you stop making progress, go do something else, try to measure what's happening and see if you get some changes. And I think that's what links everything together that seems to work. And then if you start picking apart, like, well, what's the exact method? And like, oh, lots of different people have different methods. It's pretty hard to, pick the right one. For sure. I'm interesting with like training, and there's a pretty interesting discussion going on in sports medicine and exercise. I think that's the journal. From Mark Burnley and Foster, and they about like polarized training or not polarized training. And like, is it, and this is one of the things I used to be big, like, because that's what my dad did too, is like big polarized training, tons and tons of low intensity volume, like tons, and to the point of where almost no intensity is needed. You'll do your intensity when you start your race season. And he had a lot of success with that. I mean, a bunch of my dad's athletes were really freaking good. And lots of athletes that do polarized really good. But then you get a guy like Andy Jones with Daniel Radcliffe, they're like, we didn't do any polarized training. And the more that I've always been like, maybe you need to, too much polarized training probably isn't that good either. I think you do need, depending on discipline. I mean, unless if your discipline's Ironman, then you just in tons of volume at low intensity, because that's race pace anyways. So it's interesting. I just love people who are very sure about the right method.
This is the one thing I will
give the way to do it. I'm like,
I will give you a compliment on this and props on this, is because you are the most confidently unsure person I know. You know what I mean? And every time I hear you talk, I'm like, he's so confident in being unsure about it. And it's one thing that I really admire about what you do when you talk about stuff. You're very out there and just saying, hey, I don't think we know enough to be able to say for sure. And I don't want to put anyone under the bus, but I just think it's crazy that people can be so sure that this one method is the best for all athletes. It's like, regardless of your training 10 hours a week pounding pavement versus cross-country skiing for 35 hours a week on a trail. I mean, to me, they're two completely different worlds. And the fact that you would approach those the same anyways, but I get why people are in their fields, because a lot of times they're training with specific athletes and they've had experience with specific athletes, and that's the way they see things because they've seen it very clear in those perspectives. But maybe
I do think selling confidence psychologically is important. So I mean, I know athletes like you need to know your athlete. I've made the mistake, because generally when I generally deal with coaches, which is a little bit easier, but I've made the mistake with athletes where I'm me. And the response is then basically like, I don't think you know anything about what you're talking about. And it's like, some athletes don't. Some athletes are totally cool with it. They're like, let's go. And they understand, the
process.
And so you need to gauge that, right? And so sometimes I have put on the hat, like, this is the way it is. This is right. That other shit's bullshit. Reason A, B, and C, right? I can provide reasons why I think they're wrong. I can also provide reasons why I think I'm wrong. So, but I just don't provide those reasons. But it's, I don't know. I think most people, if they're honest, will have been confronted with evidence to the contrary of what they're doing, and they just decide to not accept it. Now that's not to say you can't always do everything. If you're working in science, it's usually a little bit easier because you can be a little bit wishy-washy. Because you're not looking for an outcome per se. Well, as soon as you start with athletes, you have to look for an outcome. So you need to make a decision. So and that's fine. You just stick with your guns. You make the decision as long as you make adjustments as needed. You do get then the coaches that just successful with an athlete using this plan. If another athlete comes in, that athlete's not successful, you just toss the athlete and you bring in the next guy. I mean, that you just burn through athletes, and eventually you'll find the ones where it works, right? I mean, you don't really know if you actually got the best ones, but you got the ones where that training plan worked with them, right?
Exactly.
So
that is a good point. I've never heard that vocalized, but I do. It's funny because, for example, when I talk to MMA athletes or talk to people about MMA when training and such, I'm so confident. And the reason I am so confident, I don't realize it, but it's because I know how much bullshit there is in the field. And I'm like, for me to make any headway here, I've got to be like, no, that's the dumbest thing ever. Explain to me why you would do that. That doesn't make any sense. You're just destroying, you know, the health of the athlete, all these other things. But when I talk about other things, I'm much more, you know, back on my heels a little bit and being like, hey, I don't know, because there is much more investigation. There is much more uncertainty, right? And that line is drawn. And a lot of times the athletes are much more understanding of science and data. And Phil said the same thing. It's like the athletes that a lot of the times that he's worked with that end up being the best, the ones that test the most and the ones that have science backgrounds, because they understand the importance of data. When you understand the importance of data, you understand the over looming uncertainty with everything. And you do have to be careful who you talk to. Like I know with certain athletes and certain people, if I talk about my real concerns, you know, it's not going to be a long relationship here. I know, like it's what, you know what I mean? Like they just have this, like, how could you say that? And you're gonna train me. So yeah, it's funny. I just never heard it expressed verbally before, and that's true. You do have to mind your P's and Q's with certain athletes. And actually, this is a conversation I'm going to have with John Kiley about hormonal responses to training, you know, training programs and training periodizations and all these different things, right? How much the athlete believes in the profile or the process is going to dictate a lot of their response and adaptations, I believe. And you can see this in research with how do mice respond from forced exercise versus voluntary exercise? What are the different hormonal responses? Or some of the stuff like that's coming at, like I've heard Huberman talk about, like with Aaliyah Crum and the milkshake study and all these different things, right? Like these are always things I was thinking about when I was younger. Like, hey, if I believe that the muscle fiber is getting stronger, it's, you know, the mind muscle connection, all these things. But yeah, I think that you pointed on something very important there is, you know, certain athletes do need to be really invested. And if you shatter that, it might really destroy the process. Yeah, let's get into some of these final questions. And I mean, you can pass on some of these. They're not going to take long. Just quick answers. But let's just say you had unlimited resources and you could stay within the realm of technology that's out there now, whether it's like MRS, like proton MRS, or whether it's, you know, anything out there in the research or medical field. Maybe it's the Oxymon, right? Like this, you know, $100,000 worth of NIRS equipment. What would you choose to use as a diagnostic equipment with athletes, and why would you choose that piece of equipment if you could have it portable, compact, and with you every day?
I don't know. So like from like, say something like realistic. So if you go with like MRIs, like PMRS, so the high energy phosphate measure, I feel totally unrealistic that is ever portable, or like that's like beyond like, but like if we go with something that I do think is very interesting. I mean, my bias towards NIRS, and something that I've talked to with some NIRS experts, and something that's been proposed by like Macaulay and Hamaoka and stuff, is this idea that it is possible to generate like a NIRS suit. And interesting about the NIRS suit would be that a lot of what's difficult with NIRS is that you need a light source, which means you need energy and you need the light source. But technically speaking, the infrared spectrum is invisible in light, like, and you have infrared light everywhere. So the question is, and so this idea is that, well, you just harness basically light from outside to like enter the suit that you have on, and would give you infrared measures. And then you could make everything more flexible and small. And I think there's actually a publication out, a NIRS review by Macaulay or Hamaoka or them together, that has a picture, and it looks like a dude, he's like a speed skater, but he's got like this full body suit on, and it's like this NIRS suit. I think that would be pretty dope. So I've talked to Roger, the engineer from Moxy, about this too, because he's like, yeah, like, you know, physics wise, that he thinks that's possible, but there's technology limitations, but something that, you know, could be done. So that would be cool.
That's super interesting. Yeah, that'd be insane. I mean, who knows? Like that's within the realm. Let's talk about what was a preconceived notion or incorrect hypothesis that you've learned a great deal from, and what was the bias that preceded it? Like, how did you realize you were off course? And, you know, coming back to reflection, what was the understanding or bias that preceded you to go down that rabbit hole of incorrect hypothesis or preconceived notion?
I think I mentioned two, which are definitely two that I mentioned if I get this question asked. And the one is basically lactate and how useful is lactate. And I went from doing all these lactate measures to thinking it's completely useless, back to no, it's probably useful in certain situations. So I think the problem with lactate, or the bias that I essentially had, was confidence that lactate people had in things like 2 and 4 millimole, where I, with like 18, was like, man, I can manipulate those numbers like a madman, and you're basing training on 2 and 4 millimole. Most people don't use 2 and 4 millimole anymore. 2 and 4 millimole. I mean, even you talk to Mater, which is like one of the big 2 and 4 millimole guys. So I haven't talked to him, but I have a colleague who's talked to him about that. And apparently Mater said the 2 and 4 millimole thing was like one of his biggest mistakes. It was just a statistical analysis, and people just took it for, you know, godliness. 4 millimole, that's like the number. It's like, nah. So and apparently he's not. Yeah. He's like, yeah, I'm not. I don't know why you guys keep referring this. So maybe he got pulled into something that he didn't. He published something, and then I got stuck with it.
No, I have the paper somewhere where he even says like this isn't a good basically correlate for everyone, but we're going to use it. He basically said it right out there. But the paper somewhere on that. But you're right. And
polarized training is the other thing. Oh, sorry. Polarized training is the other thing where I've been like, it's polarized training is the way to go, and now I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I think everyone's starting to like to kind of see the other side of the coin, especially with elite athletes and runners on that. But yeah, like that's the thing. Just to touch on that, is you can manipulate any test. When people say a test is useless because you can manipulate it through, you know, physiological manipulation, whether it's breathing, whether it's contractions that you're having, over contractions, and they're saying, oh, it's useless because the athlete can, you know, over contract and pump up the levels. It's like, literally, there is not a technology out there, diagnostic tool out there, that you cannot manipulate to some degree. And so if that's your kind of basis for why something is useless, or, oh, they can throw it off by, you know, having orange juice in the morning. Well, of course you can, but testing is protocol. Just like when you go get a blood test at, you know, at the hospital, yeah, you can go and screw that up by not fasting, but is blood test useless? Because anyways, it's an annoying argument. Sorry. Just good. Okay, so if you only had one test, whether it's an incremental exercise test, a step test, critical power, FTP, that you could use with all your athletes, and you had to, you know, get to know this well, maybe it's because you want to understand it better, and you can use a diagnostic tool with that, whether it's Moxy, metabolic cart, and you had to use this specifically for 5 years, nothing else, and you only had a limited budget kind of thing, what would that diagnostic tool be, and what would the test be?
Oh, this is a trap. This question's a trap.
Just interest. I want to know why. I want to hear the thought process.
There's so much. So, like, if I go really, really hard on what you said, like I take you exactly by your word. When I mean one test, it has to be exactly that test. Yeah. So, for example, I can't say constant load tests, meaning I can vary constant load. You know, I can't. So just one. I do think an incremental step test is useful because, and I would do an incremental step test with a little bit longer steps. So I would do like 5-minute steps. Yeah. And the reason being that you do get a profile, you get a performance profile, a whole performance profile, and how you react to performance over time. And then I would use a metabolic cart or NIRS. I would probably use a metabolic cart.
Yeah.
Now, if you tell me, you know, I can use the tools in training as well, and I would bias towards using the NIRS because I can use my NIRS training, whereas I'm never using my metabolic cart in the training. Yeah. So if the same tool is the one you get to use in training, then maybe I would would bias towards NIRS, because essentially then I would definitely do a ramp or a step test, because I then in every training with my NIRS, I would be gauging my response anyways.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't stand fast to the step test response and be like, these are my training zones.
Yeah.
I'd be like, well, this is my NIRS response on my step test. So I'm going to generally create this profile, and now I'm going to go out and I'm going to go do my trainings.
Mhm.
And I get a NIRS response to my trainings. And if they don't respond as expected from my step test, well, then I adjust them.
Yeah.
Which means every training is like a test. So which means I'm kind of dodging the question. But
Yeah.
that's so,
But I see.
I don't know if that helps, but
No, and there's probably a lot more to uncover there too. You'd probably come out of that process a much further ahead maybe than you would if you did it with a cart, which many people have spent years. Okay, let's hit this one quick. Central or peripheral? Is it both? When we're talking about VO2 max limitations, I've heard people go out there and, like we were talking about, so confidently say, "Oh, it's always peripheral, always central." Do you believe that it's one? Do you believe that it's both? Do you think it's always depends? Let's just talk about elite athletes, because I think that's what a lot of people are so confident when they make the suggestions around. And those are going to be the kind of specific ones we're trying to figure out. Is there central or peripheral limitation there?
we're doing this one quick.
Just because I know this could be a whole podcast in itself. I know, but I just want to hear it quick.
Yeah, so I think probably the limitation almost at all ends is like a diffusion limitation. It's like how you can transfer oxygen, and that's going to have central and peripheral kind of dynamics to it. And it's so if I had to say, to kind of, let's keep this short, it's probably going to be what we would classically call as central.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little more complicated in that. So the reason that one of the arguments used by people who say, well, it's central, and often then people say it's cardiac output. So they use the Fick equation, and they go cardiac output, arteriovenous difference,
Mm-hmm.
and you see that the arteriovenous difference in elite athletes and untrained, that the gap there isn't that big in the arteriovenous difference, but there's this huge gap in cardiac output. So you say, well, it's the cardiac output improvement that's creating elite athletes. So we need a big cardiac output. So you got to keep getting cardiac output bigger.
Mm-hmm.
But what gets lost in that argument is that the bigger your cardiac output, the faster the flow rate of blood. If you have the same arteriovenous difference, you're extracting the same amount, but your cardiac output's way bigger, you're actually extracting way more. Your diffusion rate is way higher because the blood passing through is at a much higher rate. Yeah. And for that to stay constant, your arteriovenous difference, you need to have this really big diffusion rate. Mm-hmm. So there's some limitations to some of those cardiac outputs, is like the holy grail argument. Mm-hmm. But there is, we talked about data about this a little bit before, that if you do take trained athletes and you do biopsies and you just look at mitochondrial function, it would appear that there's a lot more capacity around in the mitochondria to consume oxygen than, right? So I do think that in trained athletes, it's likely not mitochondrial function. It's not the mitochondria's ability to consume oxygen. That's probably not the limit. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the limit is only at the level of let's say the lungs and the heart, for simplicity's sake. It could still be at the level of the muscle, but just not at the level of the mitochondria. Mm-hmm. And there's these diagrams called Wagner diagrams. I don't know if you've heard of them. No. But basically they take the Fick equation with VO2 cardiac output times arteriovenous difference. Mm-hmm. And that's called convective oxygen transport. It's just movement of oxygen convectively. And then there's this diffusion, the less commonly used equation, the diffusion equation. And this is just how well, once you have that oxygen by the muscle, how well it goes from the blood vessels, from the microcirculation into the muscle. not into the mitochondria, just into the muscle.
Yeah.
And these two things, they have to, the VO2s from these two equations, they have to be equal because of a law of conservation of mass. You can't have more oxygen consumed by the one equation than the other because they're happening in the same organism. If that makes sense for you.
Yeah.
Okay, but and you kind of get this competing result here. So what happens is, in order for the Fick equation, the cardiac output equation, to be really high, to get a high VO2, is you need a high cardiac output and you need a high artery venous difference. Okay, so that you need you basically need as much oxygen consumed as possible with a really high cardiac output, and that gives you high VO2. The problem with, if you look at the diffusion equation, then, is in order for you to diffuse lots of oxygen, you need a really big gradient. So you need a lot of oxygen available in the microcirculation to diffuse over to the muscle. But that is at odds with the convective equation. So what you need to think about this graphically is if you have microcirculation oxygen on the X scale at the bottom, so none to high, and on the Y scale, you have VO2. You have the two equations kind of do like they do an X, like this, okay? So if you want high VO2 with convective oxygen, so with the cardiac output one, you need to have very low oxygen pressure, so you get a very high value here. But if you have very high value here, you have a very low diffusion one down here. Right? Yeah. Whereas the other one's the opposite. So VO2 max actually ends up being the intersect point of the two. They're like a competition with each other. So if you look up Peter Wagner diagrams, you can look at those. And so what it turns out is that mitochondria function caps out that intersect point. But so it's not mitochondrial function in trained, likely, because that seems to be way higher. That never caps out in all these biopsy studies. It's something to do with central, but this can be convective. So this can be something like pulmonary diffusion or circulation, but it can also be just diffusion gradients at the muscular level. So I don't know if that helps, but
no, that was great.
The point is that it's probably something like central. But central not always implying like cardiac output, for example.
That was the best answer I've heard on this so far, especially so succinctly on all these, like the major point. It's funny that I actually have seen this diagram, and the Sloan and I can't remember what the other author's name is, exercise testing book, but they do talk about this, and they show the graph of that, because I remember once you talked about the X, and I'm like, oh yes, this is what they're.
It's not so. The convective one follows hemoglobin dissociation curve. It's kind of like a sigmoid pattern, but nonetheless they intersect.
And that's I know what you're talking about there. So that, I think that was super. That was just super well said. I haven't heard anyone hit on all those points, right? It's usually they stick to this one specific mechanism and kind of claim that to be the grail for where we're going to find the central peripheral. Anyways, but that was really good. I'm gonna have to re-listen to that again.
If people are confused about that, the easiest thing to do is like go get that Peter Wagner diagram, look at the chart. There's a paper modeling oxygen transport, something. It's 1996 maybe. Anyways, but if you it's a nicely written paper, and it shows a bunch of graphs and shows how it changes with training, with manipulations. Go take a look at that. I think it helps a lot with this discussion.
So the last question I have is, what are some areas of interest? I'm always interested to hear this, because it's a lot of times it draws a lot of understanding to the individual person, and like why they're interested in what they're interested in with regards to exercise physiology or the way they think. But I'm interested, what are some of your passions or expertise outside of exercise physiology? Like, is there, I know we were talking about climbing here before the start. Do you climb still, or do you climb at all, or do you hike in your thing, or what do you get at, like music, or
So not talking about expertise in any of these things, but
Yeah.
generally I'm kind of interested in everything.
Yeah.
It's kind of a lame answer, but yeah, obviously sports.
Yeah.
I like a lot of mountain sports. So yeah, I go climbing. I go bouldering. I go climbing outdoors.
Nice.
I do hiking. I do some mountaineering. I do ski touring. So a lot of that kind of stuff. All
Yeah,
just
yeah.
just hobby, low level, but mountain biking. So a lot of those things I definitely enjoy. I play basketball in the club here. Played basketball in high school, and I like general athletics and fitness and stuff. So all that sports, I almost like any. I don't know of any sport that I don't like. I'm not good at a lot of them, but I just like being active and playing sports.
Yeah.
Music, definitely. I have a big record collection. I'm definitely more of an oldies kind of guy, kind of 60s, 70s. Big Otis Redding fan. So
Oh, nice.
definitely, yeah. Love that
The
guy.
only cassette tape I still have left is Otis Redding's like best
Otis Redding,
in my
nice.
truck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, great. So definitely, I like all that. I don't know. It's maybe one of the questions that people ask me is, they feel like I'm perfectly in the job that I should be in.
Yeah,
People say, it's nice because and my response is usually like, you know what, I could see myself doing a ton of other things.
yeah.
Like I came to the realization that I would have loved to do physics. Now, I don't know if I have the capacity to do physics. That's a different question. But physics is so interesting. I read a lot of pop science books on physics stuff, which I enjoy a lot. It's just so interesting. And I realized that pretty early on that in high school, it's like, yeah, I'm exercise phys. That's what I'm going to do. Super confident.
Yeah.
But already starting in university, I did some traveling before I started university, and I kind of realized that, yeah, okay, I'm going to do this exercise phys thing. It makes the most sense. It's where I have, let's say, the most advantage. It's where I have the most networks. It's going to be path of least resistance for something that is going to be interesting. But I also realized quickly, but you know what? I also like lots of other things. And that's probably the reason why, like, my minor is English literature, which isn't a very beneficial minor for, I would have been better off taking microbiology or, I don't know, chemistry, biochemistry or something. Definitely would have made more sense career-wise. But I was like, no, I got to go do something different. So I did English literature, which I enjoyed a lot. So I read a lot of books. Which I still try to do. I don't have that much time anymore. I see you have lots of books there. So
with kids, good luck with that, folks.
Books,
kids,
So so that's kind of gets the answer to that. I do kind of like everything. I love traveling, which again is a little harder now, but experiencing things and talking to people and and I think maybe this is what I'm most passionate about is something like science.
Yeah,
I think that's I regardless of the pick, there would have been something in this realm of science, because I do really enjoy that. That's a lot of fun. Just thinking and talking to people about the world is fun. And now it just happens to be in exercise physiology and athletics, which is a lot of fun too.
That's like, I'm super glad I asked that question, because I don't always get to all these, but I'm glad I asked that one in specific, because it's super interesting. A lot of things in talking to you make sense now, especially with the uncertainty. I noticed, like, I've tried to do a lot of things in my life. I try to get good at a lot of things, and I've been through a lot of those different, cliques and groups of people and these things. And I find the more you do that, the more uncertain you become about everything that you do. I feel that people that stick to one thing, a lot of times they become very certain around a lot of things. And that makes sense, because I was the same. Whenever I only did, I did a lot, but maybe it was this small focus, and you start to become overconfident because you see the world in this kind of tunnel, right? Was when you start to branch out more into other things, you start to be like, I might sound confident in what I say a lot of times, but I'm a very doubtful person. And I see that with you. And I think the more you branch out to all these other things, you don't become really, specialized and, I'm going to solve this, problem for the world. But you do maybe end up doing that because you have such a wide, broad perspective that you can carry things into. And anyways, I'd like to just talk on this question. I'd like to hear on this question itself for like 2 hours just to hear, like, because I'm always interested when people go down these rabbit holes, because when you hear that, when I heard you talking about the stuff you're talking about and the way you're talking about it, I'm like, oh, there's probably a lot of stuff in there that, there's just be super interesting to hear. But yeah, taking up enough of your time, and I know people can find you at Near Sports Science. Is it correct? Is that your YouTube channel?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my attempt at the YouTube channel. Yeah, I try to
Yeah,
get one video up a month.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm not big. I'm not a big social media or kind of. I don't know.
that's good.
I don't know. It's. I don't, sometimes I feel like I should get more content up, but I get time is a problem. But yeah, of course, send people. They can go take a look and see see what's going on there, or if they have any questions, we can try to answer some. So I have I don't have like 30 questions in my inbox that I need to do videos on, but I usually just pick the easy ones and I ignore the hard ones.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And that's a good thing too with the social media. I just got back to social media. I didn't have for like 10 years, and my mental health is already starting to suffer from this overwhelm.
People don't respond to my channel, so it's easy. And Twitter I'm not on, but people don't write anything back. I keep worrying about the first negative comment that's going to destroy my sense of self.
Yeah. I can't. I don't know how people. I go on Twitter and I get anxiety. I just see I'm like, I don't know. I can't do it.
I'm not on Twitter. I haven't been on Twitter.
Yeah.
While I do see benefits of Twitter, like I understand it could be, but I don't know, man.
You're a squirrel. Like you're just going all this,
Yeah.
Anyways, that was great. Folks, I'll leave all this stuff in the descriptions below, so you'll be able to find his stuff there. And yeah, have a good day.